Hey, thanks for checking out Nuts and Bolts with Tone, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about a 2005 Dodge Ram Cummins with a 5.9. So the initial complaint was lack of power, and he said that he had an old can of diesel fuel and he put it in the truck, and as soon as he did, he said he noticed that it started having an acceleration problem, having a lack of power. So in a 5.9 Cummins, there's not a lot you can look at. The turbo is controlled by a wastegate. It doesn't have, it has a solenoid on there, but it doesn't have, a variable turbo like the, like the 6.7s. So you can't really look at that type of stuff. So said it when he would be on the freeway at, normal throttle, it would be going okay. But as soon as you started giving it any throttle, it would just lose power. So I test drove it and I duplicated the concern. So I set up the scan tool to graph in the 5.9, you can look at fuel pressure. So what you want to do, what I did in this one was I looked at fuel pressure desired and fuel pressure set, and also boost. So I noticed that when I was at normal driving, everything was fine, but as soon as I put my foot in it and started to give it any throttle, it would just all of a sudden, it would be going building boost, 32 pounds of boost, and then all of a sudden it would just completely just shut down, and it was like I was up against a wall. I had no power. And so luckily I was able to duplicate this concern quite often every time I held the throttle. What I noticed is if I kept my foot on the throttle, it would have power, and then it would cut off, and then it would come back and then cut off, and then come back and cut off, and it would just keep doing it. It would only come back for a quick second. So I noticed that the fuel and this thing only has 136,000 miles. So basically what I'm getting at is in this one here, it was made it sound like bad fuel was the problem, that it possibly took out the lift pump, that maybe it messed up the injection pump. So you have to determine, is that really what's going on? And you have to try to find some sort of PID that correlates with what you're looking for, what you suspect, and then how do you prove it wrong? How do you prove it not to be the case? Well, in this one here, my fuel pressure set and my fuel pressure desired were identical. I mean, they were like, here was the graphs when they were right above each other, and they looked identical. Now, if it was fuel, then what you would see is that desired would be up here, and then here we would be going, we'd be building, and then all of a sudden actual fuel rail pressure would drop, and desired would be up here. And the other thing is that you would think that most likely it would set a code. This thing had no codes whatsoever. And so this is an older diesel. I know it's an 05, but it doesn't have the technology that the newer ones have, that it can detect boost loss. It doesn't detect it very well. In a 6.7, you can have, I had a code one time for a 6.7, and it was a fairly newer truck, and it had a code basically saying the charge air pressure was incorrect, and the clamp on the over by the EGR valve was slightly loose. It had a little bit of a leak there. I actually couldn't find it by listening. I couldn't find it with anything. I had to smoke test it, and that's how I was able to find it. So that one, it set a code for even a minimal amount of boost loss, even though it didn't lose boost. This one, so then while I'm driving it, I noticed that the fuel pressure is normal. It's going normal. Everything is the same. But I noticed that every single time I lost power, boost would go from 32 to 0. Well, technically 10, because the map sensor was reading 14.9, just running. So you always have to make sure when you're looking at boost, what is the reading at just idle? Because that reading is going to get subtracted for your boost. So in this case, it was reading 14.9, and I think it ended up at like 46 or something like that. It was 32 pounds of boost, and then it would drop and boost would be gone. And then all of a sudden, boost would kick back up and I'd be having power, and then a loss of boost. Every single time, boost would disappear. So on this one, I knew that boost was the problem. I was losing boost, and that's why I had no power. If you take a modern day vehicle and it requires a turbo, it requires boost, and you lose boost or you don't have boost, it will have no power whatsoever, because it needs that turbo. It needs that boost pressure. So what I did was I popped the air box off, and I found the air filter, the screen, the top of the screen was torn. It was stuck up inside of the top of the air box. And the filter, instead of looking like flat like this, there was a section like this that was bunched up like an accordion and on top of each other. So the filter was actually only like this long, and it was like this tall. So what's happening is, while we're driving down the road, it's sucking that air filter up into the intake tube, and it's restricting the airflow, and then boost goes away, and then it tries to come back. So in this one here, we're losing boost because of the air filter. So the way I checked that was, I did a quick test, and the air filter was full of like sand and grit. So we threw that on the floor, real quick test, just buttoned up the air box and took it for one quick loop, where I was able to, I was able to duplicate it, 5 or 6 times in this one little drive, and it didn't do it once. And so I knew the air filter was the problem, and it was restricting the turbo. Now I had a 6.7 that had a lack of power, and that one was from the air filter was completely plugged, and it wouldn't allow any airflow. But in this one here, no codes, just loss of boost. So then to check the turbo to make sure, because there was pieces of the air filter missing, so we pulled off the intake air tube and checked the front of the turbo. There was nothing in it. However, I could move the turbine shaft about this far, and you shouldn't be able to move it at all. It should have very minimal play. I could actually just put the slightest amount of pressure, and it would just stop turning. And also in this one here, anytime you have a boost problem, anytime you have a turbo problem, you always want to make sure you look at your exhaust manifold gaskets and any exhaust sealing areas. In this one, I think we had 2 or 3 exhaust runners that were leaking, one in the back, one in the front, and I think there was another one, there was at least 2 runners leaking. So in this one here, we're gonna pull the exhaust manifold off and straight edge it and see if it's straight, and replace the turbo for the play, and put a new air filter. Now, anytime you're messing with a diesel, I strongly encourage you to put OEM filters in the trucks. Fuel filter, air filter, oil filter. Super important. Those aftermarket ones just don't work right. I had a 6-liter Power Stroke that I did a high pressure pump, EGR cooler, oil cooler, did the whole, oil system. I had just done injectors, previously, so I did everything else, and when I got done, it wouldn't run. It was the end of the day on a Friday. I was super pissed because I knew I didn't do anything wrong. Stupid Napa oil filter. Next day, I said, get me an OEM cap. I put an OEM cap and filter on there, fired right up. So those filters make a big difference. Make sure that you put OEM filters and get it done right. That way you're not fighting aftermarket stuff. So now I'm gonna show you what it's gonna take to replace this turbo and how to get it done. Okay, so here's how I found the air filter. It was like this. Screen was torn, and this was basically like this inside the box, like that right there. So it was all pushed up inside of here, blocking the airflow to the turbo. So that's what was going on with this. All right, so here's the new turbo here. We'll show you this so you can understand taking it apart. You got your intercooler hose here. This is where your air filter tube comes in. You got your electrical connector, which is what controls the turbo. You got your oil feed. You got your joint here where it's going to connect to the exhaust. And then this is where the exhaust manifold sits. It bolts up to the exhaust manifold with 2 bolts and 2 nuts. These you have to get from underneath. These come off from up top. You got your wastegate. If you get a good turbo, this should all be installed. Wastegate, rod, everything is adjusted. You shouldn't have to touch it. That's why you don't buy cheap stuff. And then you got the turbo drain here. Got a gasket there. Not a whole lot to it. Just got to get it out. Let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna disconnect your mass airflow sensor here, and then you're gonna pop your air filter out here. You're gonna come down here. And you're gonna take off this worm drive clamp right here and pop this whole air box out. And then we're gonna take off this intercooler hose. All right, little tech tip here. Got these sockets right here. They're snap-on. And they're four turbo clamps for intercooler and exhaust clamps. There's the part number for the one I'm gonna use right now. Basically, it is designed perfectly just for the clamps, and they're deep. It's gonna fit right on there. And it's also gonna do that one back there. Now the other little tech tip is, right when you pull this thing in and get started, spray everything with rust spray. Spray it, let it sit, and then come back and break everything loose. I'm doing the exhaust manifold on this one also, the gaskets, because they're leaking. Right there and back there. All right, so here we go. We got this manifold here. This is the old manifold and the old turbo. So the studs luckily are gonna come out pretty easily out of the turbo. So I'm gonna do that. And then whenever you pull off exhaust manifolds, you wanna make sure you straight edge the manifold. So get yourself a straight edge and lay it across. In this case, I would lay it from here and to here. And then it would be sticking up over here. And then if I pushed it down here, it would be sticking up on this end down here. So the manifold was warped, and if I hadn't have done that, then it would have just ended up, it would have just ended up leaking again. So you want to make sure you check that. In this case, the customer opted for a new manifold. So I got a new manifold. I'm going to mount that to the turbo and put this in. Okay, so a couple other little things that you want to make sure you check. One, you want to make sure that you run a thread chaser in all the holes. So in all the ones that had studs, this one, this one, this one, that one, and I want to say it was the one down here, the bolts came out and the threads were all jacked up on the bolts that came out. Luckily nothing broke. So kick myself in the butt, because I always recommend exhaust manifold hardware with manifolds that are warped or leaking. And in this one I didn't, and we ended up having to order them after the fact. So always make sure that you recommend hardware when you're doing this, and make sure you chase all these thread holes, so that way you don't have any issues when you put it back together. And before you put your turbo in, make sure you clean off this turbo drain, because once it's in, it's kind of hard to get, it's kind of hard to clean it once the turbo's in. Now in this one here, I'm putting the turbo and the manifold together and putting them in. I pulled them out together. It's easier to bolt them together when it's off the car, because of the back two. Now that this is out right here, you can see for this water pipe here, there's one bolt that goes there for the pipe. There's another one right there. Make sure you take both of those out. And then obviously this nut here that goes over the stud. Now I actually have to bend that bracket back because I bent the crap out of it just to get it out, not realizing that I had to disconnect this rubber hose. And so now I got to go and I got to fix that bracket before I put the manifold in and then put it back together. So that's about it. Let's get this manifold in. Okay, so here we go. We got the manifold and the turbo set in the hole. Got a couple bolts started. Basically what you got to do is you got to put this in here like this, and then you have to slip a gasket in and then get the bolts started on both of them, on all of them. Now, little tip for you is if your studded bolts defect, these guys right here, 4 out of 5 of my my studded bolts, the threads were defective. So I'm not gonna be able to get new ones because they're not available. So I got one good one. I'm gonna put it down here, and that's where the bracket goes for the water pipe. These 4 here, basically I'm gonna put this here like this, and then I'm gonna put the heat shield, and then I'm gonna put the bolts going through the heat shield and through this, and that's how I'm gonna bolt it up. That's the only way to do it, because you can't get the studded bolts. They're like 20 days out, or they're like crazy amount of days out, and they're really expensive. So anyways, what you gotta do, in my case, what I did was I bolted the turbo and the exhaust manifold together off the car with a new gasket. You gotta make sure that down here, your turbo drain, that's it right there, that you just have it sitting in the right area. Then you're gonna have to reach up in there and slip a new gasket and put the bolts. Make sure your turbo lines up with the pipe back here. And don't forget to put your clamp in there. Oh, the clamp, I have my clamp slid down there, so I gotta slide that up and put that on. I did this a little different than I had planned to do it. I wasn't planning on taking this all out as one assembly. But since I was doing both of them, figured it was easier to do it that way. So there's nothing really to this now except for bolting it up and putting everything back together. Just make sure that you get all your bolts started before you tighten anything up. Get all your bolts in with new gaskets. Then go down there and get your turbo drain in. That way you know it's easier to do it while you can wiggle the turbo. And then once you have that in, then torque all this down, and then you're done. Now if you're just doing the turbo, all you have to do is disconnect that one clamp right there, take the oil feed off, and undo the 2 bolts underneath for the turbo drain, and then undo that nut and that nut. And then you gotta come up from underneath, and you gotta take off that nut and one on the other side from underneath. And then the turbo comes out from under the manifold. If you're doing just the manifold, you gotta do those 4 bolts, these two nuts, the other 2 from underneath, and you have to undo this water pipe here, and then take all your bolts off, and then it comes out. So that's how you get this done. And yeah, this one's gonna be beautiful when I'm done with it. All right, so a couple things to add. When you put your manifold in, loosely put all your bolts and gaskets and your heat shield if you're having to do it the way I showed you. Get your turbo drain bolts started, and leave the water pipe off, because obviously you can't put it on until you tighten the stud past the flange of the manifold. Now this is the 2 key tips here. 1, pull your turbo up, get it pulled together. In my case, I bolted the manifold up because I've never had a problem pulling a downpipe up. In this case, I did. It took me like an hour. It was such a pain. So before you do anything, once it's all loose, you can wiggle it. Have somebody push up from underneath. If it's all loose, it'll probably come together pretty easy. I end up having to take channel locks and put them on the like the 9 o'clock position, 10 o'clock position of the downpipe, and squeeze it together to get the pipe to twist up like that. And then I was able to slip the clamp in and use my socket and my electric ratchet and pull it together real quick. If it was all loose, it would have came up a lot easier because the turbo could wiggle. So in this case, make sure that you do that. The second thing is, if you're replacing the exhaust manifold, I know you're probably not putting an OEM because it's an 05. Cummins probably doesn't make that manifold anymore. So check your water pipe. The bracket is square like this, and the manifold is here, and the square comes over to here. And so I pretty much had to cut off like this much of the corner. I had to round the bracket off like that because it wouldn't fit in the manifold. The second thing is that when I put the studded bolt in there, you put the studded bolt and you torque the manifold, then you slip the water pipe bracket on, and then you have to put a nut to bolt that bracket up. Well, the aftermarket manifold is so close to the bolt that the bolt originally, the nut is a 15 millimeter. I had to grind that thing down to 9/16, and I could barely get it on. I had to use a really thin little quarter drive wobble socket to get it on. It was such a pain. It took me like an hour to get that water pipe bracket on and tightened up, and it took me an hour to get the downpipe up. Such a pain, it took me like 2 extra hours. So take these tips. It's not going to take you 2 extra hours. Okay, so in this video I showed you how to do a turbo in a 5.9 Cummins or an exhaust manifold or both. I was a little bit mixed up on the way I explained it because I wasn't planning on doing it all together and pulling it out as one assembly. When you do that though, be careful. It's heavy. It's very heavy, it's very awkward in the way you have to slip it in. The other thing is you might want a helper when you put it in because the water pipe kind of gets in the way, and you got to kind of have that finagled a little bit to get your turbo and your exhaust manifold all in. You got to basically, as you set it in, you got to line it up with the exhaust pipe in the back and then kind of fish it around the engine mount bracket in the front, or not the engine lifting hook. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative for you. If you have any questions, comment below, and I will be sure to get back to you. Also hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit that bell. You get notified of all my future content, which you're definitely going to want to see. And check me out on Instagram at Nuts and Bolts with Tone at Instagram with my daily life as a mechanic. And you can also message me on Instagram, and sometimes it's easier for me to get back to you on Instagram. I've had a lot of people message me over there, and I'll be able to help them with their 6 liters no starts. And so anyways, so thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.